A journalist I once worked with called me an expert on death. I laughed at the time because clearly I didn't communicate what it is I actually do. And you're probably wondering what it is I actually do. Well, I don't study death. I study what happens after it, how we find our way back to life after losing someone we love. As a social psychologist and researcher, I develop tools to help support people living with serious illness like cancer and their families. And as you can imagine, through this work, I spend a lot of time immersed in the world of death and grief. But what often gets missed about the work that I do is that grief is not only about death. It's about finding our way back to life after loss. And at the center of every painful story I hear, I find beauty, resilience, and always, always love. And that's why I deeply love the work that I do. Every interview I've done, every workshop I've led with hundreds of patients during my career has shown me that we all grieve, but that grief is not only about death. Grief is, at its core, the loss of an imagined future. And we lose so many versions of our futures throughout our lives, through things like divorces, infertility, job loss, financial loss. Even retirement and empty nesting are forms of losing the lives we had and probably really liked. So many of the patients I've worked with share these losses too, because it isn't just death they face. They lose their ability to travel because they're tied to a cancer center receiving treatment. They lose their dreams of having biological children or settling down or retiring because of their cancer. We spend so much of our lives trying to avoid pain and loss, but the reality is that's just part of the deal of being human. And when we spend so much of our time being afraid of grief, we forget that it holds the power to make us better humans. And as one of my patients said to me, I had to let go of and grieve the life I wanted to love the life I actually have. And that is the power of grieving every loss. Many people have described grief as a heavy backpack that weighs them down. But here's the thing about that backpack. We don't actually get better by carrying it around with us and pretending that it isn't there. We get better by saying out loud, I have this heavy backpack, so that we can set it down for a bit, or others can help us carry the load. I often tell the patients I work with that grief is a lot like pain we feel in our body trying to signal to us, rest. When we injure our foot, for example, we're forced to literally put our feet up, and it's through that rest that we heal. In much the same way, grief is a signal to us that we need to make space to heal. And I've learned from the patients I work with that there's a 3-step framework for how to be transformed by our grief, how to set down our heavy backpacks and find things like hope, resilience, community, and compassion. And I want to share these 3 steps with you today so that we can all allow our grief to change us for the better. And I want to start with my own story. The first step to grieving is naming your loss. This step is about being honest about your loss, and that means naming it out loud. So often we tend to downplay or dismiss our losses, which prevents us from healing or allowing others to comfort us. Acknowledging our loss by naming it allows us to grieve it. Just like we have funerals, we must create formal ceremonies or processes to allow our grief to be expressed. A little over 4 years ago, I found myself in this type of loss. With 2 small kids in tow, my husband and I made the trek to what is arguably the farthest point away from New York, I guess other than Alaska, in the US. Naively, I thought the move would go smoothly and we would suddenly find ourselves in a much more expansive and, dare I say, affordable life. I could picture all the green space and the big house and the easy living that awaited me. Well, if you're human and have been alive for any amount of time, you can imagine that isn't exactly how things turned out. That was back in 2021 when we were all still observing a lot of distancing protocols for COVID-19. I thought a year of COVID isolation had prepared me for what I knew was one of the most common risks of moving, deep loneliness and a lack of community. But boy, was I wrong. I severely underestimated how that move would devastate me. I remember my then 4-year-old at the time saying to me, Mom, where are all the people? And I was left wondering that too. Everyone in my new city was either too busy to meet new friends or still avoiding hanging out in person. Nearly everyone in my office still worked remotely, so forming new connections and collaborations there was incredibly difficult. And the culture shock of moving from bustling New York City to a much quieter Seattle left me bewildered as to how to navigate this new place and actually call it my home. I had gone from a place where I'd formed deep, meaningful roots over nearly 10 years to being transplanted to a place I didn't really recognize or know where to fit in. And all these losses began to stack up. And I found myself so deeply sad. It finally hit me that what I was experiencing wasn't just sadness, it was grief. I had lost something dear to me, my community, and I had to create space for that grief so that I could move into and eventually love the life I now had. But how was I to grieve? It's not like someone died, I said to myself. So what reason did I have to grieve? When I've lost someone dear to me, I feel like I have more reason to grieve and more clarity about what it is I'm grieving. When I lost my father-in-law, I deeply grieved a future where he wouldn't pile my plate high with delicious food or get to see my kids grow up. When I lost my grandmother, I deeply grieved never getting to make her famous bread or experience her warm, radiating smile. And when I lost 2 children through miscarriage, I deeply grieved never getting to know who they would become. But the truth is I had lost so many things in moving to Seattle. I'd lost my community, my way of life, my daily rhythms. I'd lost bodegas and corner stores with clerks who knew my name and order, my kid's pediatrician who'd been with me right from the start of becoming a mother, spontaneous donut hangouts with the family friends who lived a floor above us. And each of these were real losses too. And I finally realized I had to grieve them to find comfort and heal. Every single one of us has experienced some kind of loss. A divorce, a lost job or career, infertility, not getting into the school we wanted, or maybe you're facing an empty nest and suddenly the crowded hallways piled high with shoes and books are gone, but so is the everyday sweetness of your kid's presence. In all these seasons of loss, we are both losing something dear to us and trying to figure out who we are becoming in this new life that we have. When someone we love dies, we have cultural rituals to process our grief, like funerals. But we don't have good rituals for grieving the loss of things like communities, marriages, jobs, or friendships, or future children. So that's the first step, creating that ritual by naming your loss out loud so that you can grieve it. I've seen my patients do this by naming what cancer has taken from them. Some patients talk about how their treatments have left them either so weak or so fragile that they can't do the activities they once loved, like weekend hikes or outdoor walks to enjoy the fall foliage. One patient shared with me how she finally realized she was most sad that her cancer treatments had stolen the retirement she pictured having. Instead of traveling the world with her partner, she was instead forced to be local and stay so she could get treatment. Each of these stories carries a deep amount of pain, but it's in saying that pain out loud that they're able to grieve it. And that's the first step to being transformed. You can practice this too. Ask yourself, what future did I imagine having that I've lost? And what feelings arise when I acknowledge that loss? You can write this down, you can say it out loud, consider sharing it with someone you trust. Just like our backpacks, our pain is lighter when we let others hold it with us. The second step is finding light in the darkness. One of my favorite quotes is by the Sufi poet Rumi. He says, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." And that's the goal of the second step, to start finding the light, however small, in the middle of your loss. In my many years of working with hundreds of patients, I kept seeing a consistent theme. Somehow, their grief created cracks where moments of light could enter in. For many, that light comes in the form of community stepping in to help them. I remember one patient I worked with had been so busy and so consumed that he didn't have time for much more than work when he was suddenly diagnosed with cancer. He quickly became so sick from his treatments that he wasn't able to cook for his family, something he did every night. But his neighbors stepped in and started to bring him meal after meal, and that was light. For others in grieving what they lost, they finally realized what they've gained. One of the patients I worked with mentioned the deep pain of not being able to travel any longer, which is a common loss for cancer patients. She said that it was by saying that pain out loud and that loss out loud that she realized what it had actually brought into her life. By being forced to stay put, she also was able to be rooted in a community and create lasting friendships she never would have found otherwise. This second step is how we survive our grief. Unfortunately, we can't control our futures, and it can be awful not knowing when our grief will lighten. But while we wait for our grief to lighten, we can find ways to enter places of joy and flow to survive and eventually thrive in the middle of our losses. We can enter joy through activities like gardening or cooking, savoring our morning coffee, having a special drink at the end of the day with our partner. We can connect with others by joining a club or taking a class or trying a new hobby or inviting a friend to share in a weekly ritual with us. Each of these acts infuses our lives with more joy, and our joy multiplies when we share it with others. One of the patients I work with shared this reality as she talked about finding deep meaning and joy in tutoring small children. She used to be a teacher but could no longer work full-time after her cancer treatments. But that tiny spark of flow and connection she experienced by tutoring brought her back into her joy. These moments of joy are ways to come up for air in the middle of our grief. It doesn't mean we aren't still swimming in the ocean of grief, but it does give us enough air to keep swimming. For me, I had to start digging into tiny joys that were only available to me in my new life in Seattle. It was important for me and my own grief journey to start letting light in that I knew was only available to me through the loss that I was experiencing. And so I set out on a challenge to myself. I asked myself, if I had to leave Seattle in 1 year from now, what would I do before I left? And I started doing those things. I started spending more time with my sister who lives nearby. I started agate hunting at beaches and going on trips to see the Pacific Ocean. But I also started picking up daily rhythms of tiny things that I enjoy. To this day, I now start almost every morning with a warm cup of coffee and my paper journal to write in. That tiny ritual has allowed me to discover my immense love for writing, something I never would have found without my loss. One way to do this on your own is to make what I call a one joy a day list, where you write down one thing you either will do that brings you joy or one thing you did do that brings you joy. Keep doing these things, no matter how small. The final step focuses on how grieving our losses can transform us and ultimately the people around us. If we allow them, our losses can transform us over time. They can bring clarity to our lives by opening new opportunities or forging new paths of love, but they can also make us more compassionate people by empathizing with and helping others who are facing loss too. This final step is where we can find that our grief can leave us as more purposeful, compassionate, and empathetic people. Because once you've lost something and grieved that loss, you can then go on to comfort people facing that same loss. One way to discover how our grief is transforming us is to write down what we've learned through our grief, and we can then share that with someone going through a similar struggle. Or we can do small acts of kindness to honor what was lost. Many of the patients and families I've worked with end up creating charities in their loved ones' names as a way to connect and give back to their communities. But it doesn't have to be this big. Even small acts, bringing a meal to someone struggling or in need, writing a card thanking someone for their presence, or just encouraging someone who's facing what you have faced. All of these small points of connection and compassion ripple outward, building a community of care that continues our story beyond us and our grief. This final step reminds us that our stories of facing and surviving our losses and becoming softer, kinder versions of ourselves in the middle of it hold the power to impact and heal not only us, but other people facing loss too. For me, my loss showed me that I'm not immune to feeling alone or on the outside. And now I look for those people and find ways to invite them in, to have a seat at the table, to feel like they belong and that they're connected. And slowly, over time, my community started to form around me. I'm so thankful for the many patients and families with whom I've worked. They've taught me that there's power in grieving our many losses. They've taught me that even in the face of death, they still make space to acknowledge and grieve their many losses that go beyond death. And so should we. So often we ignore our losses outside of death, viewing them as not big enough or important enough to grieve. Yet each of these losses impacts us in many ways and wears us down over time. With every change and loss, we are forced to forge a new identity. For me, It was losing an identity central to who I was, a New Yorker, and putting on a new identity where I had to find new roots, new patterns, and new ways of living. For you, it could be heading into retirement or facing aging, a divorce, a miscarriage, or an empty nest. Whatever loss we are facing, it deserves to be grieved. Grief will always be a part of being human. We lose loved ones. We lose health, jobs, communities, and dreams. But what my research, my patience, and my own life have taught me is that grief doesn't have to be where the story ends. If we face our pain, allow ourselves to feel it, and remember that our story continues, grief can become the very place where joy, resilience, and love take root. So the next time you feel that quiet ache of loss, the move, the breakup, the health setback, don't dismiss it as not big enough to grieve. Acknowledge it, give it space, grieve it. Because it's in those very cracks that the light starts to get in, and where you just might discover a more meaningful, peaceful, joyful, and connected life. Because grief creates a spark of life, an opportunity to grieve and to be comforted. And each of us carries that spark, the ability to grieve and to comfort. And when we grieve openly, we light one another's sparks, and together we can create a fire that warms the world.